As ANEC President, it is a pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of ANEC, the European Consumer Voice in Standardisation, and ASI CC, the Austrian Standards Institute's Consumer Council. I welcome you to this landmark conference on chemicals that may come into contact with consumers, especially chemicals from consumer products. And we have the honour of our event being supported and held in cooperation with 7 national authorities from Austria, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands and Sweden. And these are the Austrian Ministry of Health, the Austrian Ministry of Labour, Social Affairs and Consumer Protection, the Belgian Public Service for Health, Food Chain Safety and Environment, the Danish Environmental Protection Agency, the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment, the German Federal Environment Agency, and last and certainly not least, the Swedish Chemicals Agency. However, a comprehensive and systematic approach to address chemicals in products is still missing, and with today's follow-up conference, we aim at identifying concrete options for regulatory action.
For me, the question is really that we can get from those presentations and your interventions and participation a signal to see what does that mean towards the EU level for the regulators, the decision makers, and it's good that we have not only the Commission present here speaking, but I understand also colleagues of you are in the room from the European Commission, and I'm sure they will participate actively and listen.
The first 2 studies that we commissioned were a gap analysis of existing European regulations for articles as far as chemicals are concerned. The summary of this is best displayed using a picture. This is the picture of an Emmental cheese, and you see a lot of holes in this. I think that is the situation that we have. We have a regulatory framework that consists of some substance, but it consists of numerous gaps and holes. The result of the analysis of some 18 pieces of legislation can be summarized as follows. We have, for most of the products, we have virtually no specific requirements except maybe some restrictions in Annex 17 of REACH. We have mostly rules of very general nature, make it safe, as for instance the General Safety Product Directive. Where we do have provisions in place, then we still have considerable gaps. And on the one hand, on the other hand, we have regulations in place that are insufficient and do not represent a high level of safety. Now, some people say REACH takes care of all these problems that we have. We do not share these opinions for a number of reasons. First reason is that articles, in fact, are just briefly covered in REACH. Yes, there is a registration requirement, but only if substances are deliberately released, which is the very exception. This is the famous perfumed eraser and similar products. This is not really relevant. Then we have a notification requirement for substances of very high concern in articles. Not sure whether this helps a lot, and I'm also wondering how that works in practice, but this clearly doesn't solve the problems. But there are more problems regarding REACH. It's not only the coverage of articles. REACH is to a large extent a registration procedure. Registration is based on self-assessment by industry, which we do not necessarily find reliable. Consumer protection must be based on independent assessment of scientific committees. It should also not be overlooked that neither authorization nor registration leads at the end to limits in products that are enforceable. The only path in REACH that leads to limits is the restriction path, but this is a very laborious and time-consuming exercise, taking sometimes several man-years of work to produce a restriction dossier. This is also a way of preventing that measures are taken to keep people busy for many years. So this, I think, is clearly not a way that can be used to comprehensively cover chemicals in articles. REACH is characterized by a lack of flexibility to make quick changes, also in terms of exceptions. Think about the ROSE directive, which allows manufacturers to apply for exemptions when a certain limit cannot be fulfilled in a certain application. Then, by using a comitology, this exemption can be granted. REACH follows a substance-by-substance approach. And this excludes a number of other approaches, for instance, the approach to ban groups of chemicals, such as CMR chemicals or halogenated flame retardants. Also, REACH is not the instrument to allow you to follow a positive list approach, as we have it in certain pieces of legislation, like plastic materials in contact with food, or also in the cosmetics regulation. There is a positive list approach for certain ingredients like preservatives like colorants or like UV filters. When we regulate chemicals, we do not only regulate toxic properties of chemicals. There are also organoleptic parameters as regards food contact materials. There are some proxy parameters like TVOC, which we use, for instance, in indoor air schemes. Non-intentionally added substances are also not covered by REACH unless these are impurities of individual substances. But if the chemical is a reaction product of the processing of the product, then it is not covered. Think about nitrosamines or nitrosatable substances that are formed in the vulcanization process of the production of rubber. So this is not an intentionally added chemicals. And last but not least, I have already mentioned that the consumer information provisions are not adequate. So taking this all together, we can say that REACH is definitely not an instrument to regulate chemicals in products. It's not a substitute for product regulation. REACH is a good instrument to generate data. That's, I think, its main benefit.
So one of the objectives of the 7th EAP is to safeguard EU citizens from environmental-related pressures and risks to health and well-being. And water, air pollution, and chemicals are the general public's top environmental concerns in the EU. And we have also this very concerning number of WHO estimating 15 to 20% of deaths in the EU due to environmental stressors. So REACH is central to achieve these goals because it reverses the burden of proof and enables enforceable action by authorities. What do we mean by this? So, like was said before, the chemicals that found their way into products, into the environment, now it is the task of the industry to test them before they are placed on the market. And indeed, it's a change of approach. And it internalizes the cost of environmental and health protection in the products that are sold, and it promotes in the longer run substitution and also lower environmental and health protection costs on the substances of very high concern. That are basically those substances that are in the waiting room for authorization. There was a commitment from both Commissioners Tajani and Potočnik that the candidate list should include 136 SVHCs by the end of 2012, which it does, and have all relevant currently known SVHCs included in the candidate list by 2020. Of course, now the key is to define what is meant by relevant, and that's one of the most important tasks right now in the Commission services, and there are those discussions on this topic building on risk management options between ECHA, Member States, and the Commission. So basically the key areas that are also going to be in the future of our work on REACH. Like I mentioned already, nano-materials is a very important one. So we are working now towards this amendment of annexes. Endocrine disruptors is also well underway. And then further probably in a longer run is also the importance to include cocktail effects into the current legislation we have.
I would like to introduce you the legal background for food contact materials, how we are addressing risks from food contact materials at the EU level. But I will not concentrate on what we have achieved, but I want to concentrate on where are the gaps. You have to see that food contact materials are well linked and covered in the framework of food safety. Because what we are looking at and what we are concerned with is what chemicals are leaching into the food and thus could pose a risk to the consumer by the release into the food. We are having the overarching principles set out in the framework regulation, which means that the materials should not release substances in concentrations that could pose a risk to health or change the organoleptic properties of the food. So this is enshrined and is the same principle which are set out in the food legislation. As regards the specific measures, you can see, as was mentioned before, we have only a few materials where we have used this comitology principle to set out material-specific rules. As said before, for plastics, we have taken the approach of a positive listing. This took us 30 years to have now a bit more than 900 substances. So this you have to keep in mind if you are saying we want to favor a positive listing. So we have a handful of member states which are working with lists of authorized substances, or for the Council of Europe, inventory lists. These are covering mainly paper and board. Coatings, there are some for adhesives, printing inks, rubber. We have different options. The no option, we don't do anything. We can establish lists of substances or materials or processes. We could have negative lists, getting clearer obligations and criteria for risk assessment, setting out obligations and criteria for information exchange, or detailed material-specific rules and combinations of the above.